Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your in-depth look at how news from around the world is affecting Taiwan. I'm Jaime Okan. A week-long naval exercise is happening off the coast of Sydney, Australia. These are called the Malabar Naval Exercise. They incorporate India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. These four countries are part of a strategic forum called Quad. Now, Quad is not an official pact or treaty, but rather a framework that pushes for deeper security cooperation between its members. These types of mini-alliances are important for Western countries to counter China's increasing military presence in the Indo-Pacific region. But can Quad actually contribute to stabilizing regional security? Well, for more on this, I'm joined by Tom Corben. He's a research fellow at the Foreign Policy and Defense Program at the United States Study Center in Australia. Tom, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I kind of want to just jump in and zoom out first and look at what kind of Quad is and what's its function.
Sure. So a very basic baseline to begin with. The Quad is comprised of four countries: Australia, Japan, India, the United States. It essentially functions as a forum where the leaders of all four countries, but also foreign ministers and senior officials from the foreign ministries of all four countries, can get together in different styles of forums to discuss issues that are of mutual strategic importance across the Indo-Pacific. So this includes regional security problems, but it's also expanded in recent years to include what you would traditionally kind of consider to be non-traditional issues like climate change, humanitarian aid and disaster relief, energy security, supply chains, vaccines in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, those sorts of things. So it's really a forum for the four countries to get together and discuss these mutual challenges.
Is there any reason why it's these four countries specifically? Because if you look at a map, they're pretty separated, in terms of, geographical distance. And is there anything that these countries have in common?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things the four countries have in common. At a very basic level, these are the four largest maritime democracies in the Indo-Pacific, perhaps with the exception of Indonesia. But they also critically share kind of a convergence of strategic perspectives when it comes to the nature of the regional order that the four countries would like to see, as well as the measures that the four countries believe that they need to take, not just individually, but in concert with one another to make sure that that order is realized.
And when we look at alliances or blocs or whatever you want to call them, traditionally we look at stuff like the EU and NATO and ASEAN. But Quad is interesting in the sense of it's not a legally binding agreement. It's more of like a dialogue, like you said. But how does Quad's unofficial kind of nature play to its advantage, or any sort of kind of benefits that I can take from that?
The flexibility that the Quad's unofficial nature has given it in the years that it has really been active means that it is less provocative to states in the regional order that might be reluctant to engage with blocs or alleged kind of mini proto-alliances as they've been framed. But it also means that the Quad countries can not only engage on these issues together and pursue these in a collective way, but it's really a forum for these four countries to bring their views and their sometimes divergent, but sometimes comparative perspectives together to really just share views on things. The Quad isn't necessarily a vessel for always doing things, at least in the years that it's existed. It's only in recent years where we've really started to see meat put on the bones.
And when you said that, the fact that it's not trying to provoke any sort of geopolitical issues, if it's kind of maybe won't provoke that sort of reaction, why is it difficult maybe for countries to then join into Quad and maybe expand that to 5, 6, or 7 countries?
So I suppose the reason why the discussion around adding countries to the Quad, which has been referred to as TaiwanPlus, for example, hasn't really progressed from theory to reality, is because of the strategic convergence that these four countries have in terms of their geopolitical outlooks and perspectives. It's taken a long time for these four countries to really get on the same page, not just about the nature of the strategic environment and the challenges that they face, but the necessity of actually getting together and making that political capital investment at home and abroad to make sure this is a reality. So if you think about what would bringing a fifth party or a sixth party into the Quad entail, that would require dealing with a whole new set of political imperatives, of geopolitical perspectives, and perhaps even divergent strategic perspectives to what the Quad countries already share. So it really could complicate things at what is still really an early stage for the Quad. As I said before, we're only really starting to see meat put on the bones of the Quad's tangible, productive agenda. So bringing in a fifth or a sixth party right now might actually be more counterproductive than productive.
And it's really interesting because we've spoken on this topic before, this whole thing of mini-lateralism, these mini alliances, specifically in Asia because of the security environment there. But are we seeing a trend happening maybe across the world, this sort of like theory of mini-lateralism with other countries?
Yeah, so I think you're seeing that pattern in motion across the Indo-Pacific writ large. Obviously, the Quad is perhaps one of the most shiny examples of minilateralism in action, focused as it is right now on providing common goods to the region to improve the region's resilience to non-traditional security challenges. But you're also seeing minilaterals pop up or be revived in some cases, which are much more focused on security or specific elements of security cooperation. AUKUS is perhaps another shiny example here to point to, given how much media coverage it's received. This, of course, is a defense technology partnership, really, between Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. But you've also seen South Korea, Japan, and the United States revamp their own security cooperation in recent years. Again, this partnership has traditionally been very focused on defense cooperation around the Korean Peninsula, but is now starting to expand to look at other things like energy, environment, supply chains, and what have you. And there are other minilaterals to speak of that don't necessarily get the same amount of attention, but are increasingly relevant to the security landscape. So the foremost among those would be the Australia, Japan, United States trilateral, which again is very focused on high-end deterrence.
Before we move on to trilateral, I want to ask you one more thing. In your personal opinion, looking at treaties and partnerships versus frameworks, do you think frameworks have more of an advantage, or are they more effective given that like loose set of laws that it's not actually legally binding?
I think frameworks are more relevant to the current strategic environment where a lot of countries are still hedging their bets, so to speak, when it comes to what the future regional strategic order will look like, and the weighting between the United States and China when it comes to who determines what that order looks like. But I mean, it also allows countries to engage more freely with one another, irrespective of their engagement with China and the United States. So I think the frameworks that you're seeing built by countries like Australia and Japan in their own bilateral relationship, between Korea and Japan increasingly, between India and Australia, these things are happening much more quietly than the shiny minilateral partnerships that I just spelled out, but these are equally significant developments.
And speaking of this sort of cooperation, there is a joint summit happening between Japan, South Korea, and the United States. And Japanese Prime Minister Kishida Fumio said that this meeting with U.S. President Joe Biden and South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol will strengthen the country's strategic relations, especially looking at common threats from Russia and North Korea. But Tom, have we seen this relationship evolve with the three countries in light of the security environment, or how is this kind of coming about?
So this is in part driven by a shared sense of urgency around the North Korean missile and nuclear weapons threat. This has been a traditional driver of trilateral security cooperation between the three countries. I think there's some degree of shared concern over Chinese activities across the region, but also in terms of its economic coercion, particularly of South Korea and Japan in recent years, as well as its kind of political interference activities across those countries. But China traditionally hasn't been a large driver of this trilateral. So perhaps that is one new factor you might point to. I think the other thing that's worth pointing out here is that Japan-South Korea bilateral relations were really at rock bottom only 18 to 24 months ago. So it's pretty remarkable that not only are the three countries looking to expand the remit of their cooperation, but the three leaders are willing to get together in one of the most public forums you can for public diplomacy, which is at the White House. So, at least in Tokyo and Seoul, that is a representation of a significant investment of political capital, and you can't ignore that.
Would you say, this idea of you see Quad and you see this sort of framework building up between those four countries, and because Japan is part of Quad and South Korea isn't, do you think South Korea has maybe some sort of, I wouldn't say fear of missing out, but seeing that joint cooperation happening with other countries, it also wants to get involved in a similar partnership? Do you think that maybe is one of the motivating factors?
Yeah, perhaps. I wouldn't pin this exactly on the Quad, but I think there's perhaps a perception evolving in South Korea that the bus is moving, so to speak. And if you don't get on the bus, you might get left behind when it comes to the modernization of the US alliance network in Asia and the better networking of those alliances between each other and not just with the United States. I think there's a renewed interest in Seoul to get more involved in partnerships with countries like Australia and India, for example, which it hasn't traditionally seen as a major security partner. But I also think that South Korean strategists are more than savvy enough to recognize the trends in the regional strategic environment that strategists in other capitals like Tokyo, Canberra, New Delhi, and Washington have been seeing for some years.
And going back to Quad, I remember studying as a university student, this whole news of, Quad is this framework, it's emerging. Can Taiwan maybe join that? The fact that there's no legally framework for it to join. But is there any possibility of Taiwan joining Quad, or any sort of maybe what Taiwan could offer as maybe an unofficial partner, or even as an official partner?
So I think the political barriers to including Taiwan in any sort of official capacity in a forum like the Quad or something like AUKUS or another minilateral forum are still probably much too high for that to actually function in an official way. There are probably areas where Taiwan can benefit from the outputs of such minilateral cooperation. So, for example, closer military cooperation between Australia, Japan, and the United States does a lot for regional deterrence and does a lot to serve Taiwanese strategic and defense interests as well. There's probably also scope for Taiwan to possibly be involved in a Quad Plus framework. And when I talk about a Quad Plus framework, the plus is not a permanent membership position. So in other words, you would have kind of small issue-focused subgroups that rotate around the Quad center of gravity, being its 4 kind of permanent members, if you will. And these kind of, these smaller groups will be made up of a variety of countries depending on the issue that's at hand. So, in my opinion, you could probably see scope for Taiwan to be involved in a health security initiative that pivots on the Quad, for example. But I wouldn't necessarily see scope for Taiwan to be involved in anything around maritime domain awareness or anything that's leaning more heavily into the traditional security and defense space. I think that would just be a political bridge too far for the countries involved.
And given that trend of future cooperation, we're only going to see more of it. How do you think China has been reacting to this? And do you think it's going to build up its own Quad? I mean, we've seen BRICS in a sense try to be an unofficial framework, but do you see maybe Beijing trying to kind of counter that increased cooperation between the Western allies?
I mean, China will seek to build relationships with countries that it feels like will accommodate its interests and cooperate in a way that serves Beijing's interests. So I think you've seen that with the deepening relationship between China and Cambodia, for example, between China and the military government in Myanmar right now. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that China will try to emulate the ways in which the United States has built up and maintained its own network of alliances and partnerships in the Asia-Pacific. China is probably going to approach this in a way that better suits its own interests and its own strategic prerogatives. And in some senses, I'm not a China expert, but I know enough and I understand enough to know that some strategists in China see alliances as somewhat of a burden and an obligation that Beijing doesn't necessarily want in this strategic environment, at least right now.
And finally, I want to ask you, looking into the future, what do you think is going to be the most important thing that we can expect to come out from these alliances going forward in the future, in sort of in the sense of contributing to regional and global security?
So the thing that I will be looking for in terms of these minilateral groupings is how quickly they can move from translating the shared strategic consensus, which they are all based around, regardless of the issue that they're focused on, translating that consensus into actual operational or tangible gains. I think that has been one of the greatest criticisms of the Quad, particularly for years since it was first created, particularly since it was revived in the early 2020s. And in the last couple of years, as I've said a couple of times, you started to see some meat put to the bones of this agenda. But even then, there have been some hiccups and some stumbles with the actual implementation and execution of these initiatives. And that's to be expected when you have 4 countries cooperating on something as large as vaccine distribution across the Indo-Pacific for the first time. But really, I think what we should be looking for is how the 4 countries in this case learn lessons from those initial projects and apply that to other initiatives going forward to make sure that these deliver in a timely and effective manner.
Well, I'll be looking for that as well. But thank you so much, Tom. Thank you for coming on today's show.
No worries. Thanks again for having me.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from TaiwanPlus, make sure to follow us on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.